No promises. All right. So we are recording. So welcome to the presentation on parliamentary procedure. Let me take a moment to introduce myself. I am not Mark Stratton, which any of you who've met Mark Stratton will probably note that. He was supposed to be doing this presentation, but he had a couple of issues come up unrelated to APO, so he was unable to do this. Mark is an old friend of mine. He and I served on the board of directors. We started at the same time, each region directors in our own place. And but I will do my best to fill in for him. I am not as enthusiastic about parliamentary procedure, only because I don't know that anybody is as enthusiastic about parliamentary procedure as Mark is. But I've certainly had a good deal of experience with running meetings and using parliamentary procedure. So we'll go from there. My name is Mike Haber. I have a nickname in the fraternity, which is Spree, and gets used widely in some places. So you're welcome to call me Mike or Spree, or for today only, you can call me Mark Stratton, but I would prefer you didn't. I've done a variety of things in the fraternity. As I mentioned, I was on the National Board of Directors for several years. In fact, actually, I just concluded a term this past year. I'm currently the Advisor Development Program Chair, so I'm helping to develop some training for advisors. I've been a region director. I was the National Service Director. I was a section chair, and I've been a chapter advisor. And way back when, I was a chapter president, and certainly, you know, ran meetings. And at that time is when I started my own experience with learning parliamentary procedure. I do also want to give a shout out to a longtime Alpha Phi Omega volunteer, Jeff Cantor. He's not here today, but he provided these slides. Again, this all kind of came together very last minute to fill in for Mark. So he also is quite expert in parliamentary procedure. And so I'm glad that he had a prepared deck so I didn't have to put something together quickly. So we're going to go through today, and we're going to talk about some basics of parliamentary procedure and meeting management. So first, it's probably good to start off with answering the simple question, what is parliamentary procedure? And simply put, parliamentary procedure is a set of rules to conduct meetings. Now, there's a variety of them out there. Robert's Rules is the best known, and we will be kind of relying on that as our basis for this. It's also a method for making decisions as a group. I think you could say the overriding idea here is that you want to reflect the will of the majority, while at the same time allowing everybody's voice to be heard. So that's key. You've got, you know, everybody who's a member of an organization has a right to be heard there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you want the decision to reflect the will, the overall will of the group. And that's the key thing. So allowing everyone to be heard while enacting the will of the majority. So how does it help a chapter? Well, it can help make meetings run more efficiently. It gives you some clarity in how decisions are made. You know, everybody will understand how we are coming to decisions. That's the ideal. You want everyone to be able to have a fair say in getting their voice heard and in making those decisions. The rules should never be an impediment to a chapter functioning. You know, I've certainly seen chapters that kind of get caught up down in the weeds sometimes in parliamentary procedure. That is contrary to what parliamentary procedure is for. It's not meant to obfuscate. It's not meant to make it harder. It's meant to have just a clear, direct way to make those decisions. And also, you know, to address this third bullet here, not for nothing, parliamentary procedure will assist voting delegates who go to convention. Now, has anyone out there been to a national convention before? Normally I would ask for a show of hands, but you know, I'll just kind of scroll through, and I see a couple of folks saying yes. And you know, I love national conventions. They're great. They're arguably the most fun you can have in Alpha Phi Omega. At the same time, they're also very necessary for conducting the business of the fraternity. We had a virtual legislative session, as was just pointed out in chat. That reminded me of that. We had our virtual legislative session this past December. That was kind of a very mini version of the legislative session at Nationals, but we did utilize parliamentary procedure there quite heavily. And at the convention, the legislative session will. The larger the group that you have is kind of determines how much you need to rely on parliamentary procedure. So if you have a smaller chapter, and small can mean different things to different people. But let's say you've got a really tiny chapter, 10 people. You don't need to rely heavily on parliamentary procedure because with 10 people, you can much more easily manage the room. So you don't need to go too deep into it. On the other hand, at National Convention, when you've got hundreds of delegates from various chapters, and you've got some really, sometimes very hotly debated topics that are going to come up, you need to have a good organized structure. And that's where parliamentary procedure really shines, is in that sort of environment. So let's go from there. Ooh, there we go. It's important, it is of course important for everyone to know the basic procedures. You don't need to be an expert. If you've ever seen a book for Robert's Rules of Order, it is a thick book. There are a lot of particular nuanced things. Everything that can happen in a meeting has been predicted. I'll say that. That probably is an overstatement, but not much of one. Robert's Rules of Order tries to predict every possible combination of things that might happen, and so it is going to tell you what's allowed, what's not allowed. Your chapter does not need to get to that level of detail. I'm telling you right now, if you do, you're probably just making things a lot more complicated for everybody. But the basic procedures are something that everyone should know, and that'll be helpful. So what are the basic elements of parliamentary procedure? Well, you have meetings, obviously. You have minutes. Then you have decision making. In particular, there we're talking about motions and voting. You have nominations and elections for various chapter officers. You have an organizational structure as part of parliamentary procedure. And for most chapters, the most evident aspect of that is the bylaws. And then you have parliamentary authorities who are kind of telling you what rules you will be utilizing and helping you to interpret those rules. So we'll go into these a little bit more. Now for meetings, I'm going to guess everybody here has been in a meeting. Your chapters all have meetings, I'm sure. Perhaps in recent times, they've been virtual meetings. Prior to that, they would typically be in person. Regardless of the format, there's a certain decorum in meetings. The chair runs the meeting. Normally, in most chapters, the chapter president is the chair. There may be exceptions to this. Some chapters will occasionally do things a little differently in that regard, but the vast majority, the president runs the meetings. Sometimes the president may not be there and another officer may substitute for them, one of the vice presidents or something. Anyone at the meeting can speak, but only after being recognized by the chair. So that's important. There are limits that can be placed on how long and how often someone might speak. Particularly, again, if you have larger organizations, it might be that each person can only speak twice, 3 times or something, or maybe even only once on a given topic. There's also an agenda to meetings. Typically, hopefully, if you're in a meeting without an agenda, it can easily go awry. But just even a simple agenda is something that would be necessary there. And that helps keep things very organized. So let's talk about that agenda, because this is something that usually would be set prior to the meeting occurring. Now, the basic of agenda is what you see here. Meetings typically follow this format, even if they're not laid out this way intentionally. They usually will follow along this this path. So there's the call to order. If there's a traditional Alpha Phi Omega opening with 3 sharp taps of the gavel and so forth, you might have heard. But regardless of how it's done, the meeting is called to order. It's started. Then you would typically have the reading, I'll put that in quotes, / approval of minutes. The majority of the time, no one's actually going to read the minutes, but there is, the approval of them. And hopefully folks have had the opportunity to. Then you will have officer reports. You may have committee reports as well. They may be combined together. Then you'll have special orders, which is any specific business of the meeting. So in your agenda, you may have, your officer reports, and then you've got a few particular topics. Maybe there's a big service project coming up that needs to be discussed as a group, or some decisions made on. Or there may be, a particular, maybe formal is coming up. You need to make decisions on that. Something special that you're talking about. It would be the special orders there. You may not have any, and that's perfectly okay. Things may get handled just within the reports, and then the old business and new business. So speaking of those, old business, just like it sounds, those are things that are carried over from a previous meeting. Something that you've talked about before, maybe it got tabled, or maybe there was, it needed to be talked about once and then decided later. But that's the old business. New business is anything, just like it sounds, anything new that is being brought up for the first time. So decisions that are going to be made that you haven't talked about before. Then you have announcements, which are just something, no decisions are made there typically. This is just sort of informational for the body. And then there's an adjourning of the meeting, and that's when you formally bring the meeting to a close. So we'll dive down a little bit more into some of these minutes. I guess the first question to ask is, why are they important? And so let me just actually throw that out to the group. Feel free to raise your hand, or if you aren't able to do that, just unmute yourself. We'll figure out, we'll keep things in order. But let me ask that question. Why do you think minutes are important? Yes, Carlin.
They're important to keep a record of everything that the chapter does.
Absolutely. Minutes are the formal decisions, the official decisions of the chapter. So again, that official record, and they're also there to help people who may have missed a meeting to keep up. Now, ideally, you keep your minutes and you store them off somewhere so that everyone can access them, whether that's remotely, or, in the olden days, they would have actually been printed out and stored somewhere. But it's important for people to be able to refer back. And that can be really handy if a chapter is discussing something and they think that they may have already covered that somewhere, but maybe it was last semester or just a few weeks ago and there was a lot going on. You can go back and see exactly what was decided. So we come to the question of how those minutes are handled. They do record what was decided. They don't typically record what was said. That's not really necessary. There can be 20 minutes of debate on a given topic. And ultimately, it's irrelevant after the decision is made. I mean, I say irrelevant, obviously, for business purposes. At the end of the day, the chapter talked about this issue and they decided this. We decided we're going to do that thing, or we're going to not do that thing. That should be recorded. Motion was made to do a thing. Chapter took a vote. It was decided we're not going to do the thing, or we are going to do the thing. That's all that needs to be recorded. So you could have an hour-long meeting that boils down to like 2 or 3 lines of minutes that are just, we voted on this, decided to do it, and so forth. Now, I talked about reading the minutes in quotes. They should be reviewed. There should certainly be an opportunity so that people have the opportunity to review it to make sure that they're accurate. Because, whoever's taking the minutes, we're all fallible. They may have made an error. They may have recorded something wrong, or they may have missed something that was relevant. So if the minutes are recorded, which they should be circulated. And that's why we don't approve minutes until the next meeting. So you have a meeting, minutes are taken, they're sent out to the group to review. And then at the next meeting, if you remember, the very first thing that we do after a call to order is we approve the minutes from last time. And again, in very old times or very formal meetings, the minutes may actually be read to the group at that time. Alpha Phi Omega chapters don't typically do that, and probably don't need to. That would really just add some time to your meeting. After the minutes are approved, they should be published so everyone has access to them. Now, decision making, this is really the meat of a meeting and the meat of parliamentary procedure. All your decisions happen through motions. And I'm sure you've all encountered this. A motion is made. There are 4 broad types of motions. There's what's called the main motion. There's a subsidiary. There are privileged motions and incidental. So we'll go through a little bit of what each of those types are about. The main motion is when you introduce a topic for discussion. So this is a new topic that is being discussed. This is the main decision you want to make. So this could be, I motion that we have cookies at all meetings. That could be a motion. And I would personally support that, but your mileage may vary. So that would be introducing a topic for discussion. A motion is made. It cannot be made when another topic is being discussed. So if you're already talking about whatever topic, if there's another motion that's on the floor, there's some specific topic that is going on, you can't just randomly introduce another motion. So if you're if there's a motion on the floor to approve the budget for the year, you can't just randomly say, I motion we have cookies at every meeting. That would be out of order. You've got to wait till there's an opening for new motions to be introduced. The main motion, and we'll talk about an order of precedence in just a little bit. Interestingly, the main motion is actually the least, well, I won't say least important. It yields to all other motions because, again, you have to have a completely clear floor at that moment in order to make a motion. You can't be discussing any other motions. And when we get to precedence, that'll be a little clearer what I mean there. Subsidiary motions are things that are made when there is already a main motion on the floor. So you've got your motion to have cookies at every meeting. You want to do something to change that. You might motion to amend that to say, I'd like to change it so that we have brownies at every meeting, or I want to motion it to say that we have chocolate chip cookies specifically at every meeting. So that would be an amendment. And that's usually what subsidiary motions are, but there are others as well. But they in some way change or have an effect on the main motion. And therefore, they have to be voted on prior to the main motion. So for those of you who've been to National Convention, whether it was virtual or an in-person one, you've undoubtedly seen this kind of thing occur, where there is a motion and there is a motion to amend it. We immediately then switch and we're talking about the motion to amend. And there's all kinds of discussion about that. And then when we're done talking about the motion to amend, we take a vote on that. We're not talking about the main motion yet. This is we're going to amend it. So again, we haven't decided, in my example, we haven't decided yet that we're going to have cookies at every meeting. We're just going to talk about whether we're going to have chocolate chip cookies specifically. So you may be in favor of having cookies, but not in favor of them being just chocolate chip. So you might vote against the amendment, even though you're going to vote in favor of the main motion. So that's subsidiary motions. Privileged motions are not related to the main motion at all. So they have nothing to do with the main motion. They're usually dealt with before other motions. They can interrupt. Examples of this would be a point of privilege or to recess. Now, people get confused sometimes about points. Just points of information, points of order, points of privilege. So point of privilege is, as you might expect, a privileged motion. A point of privilege is when it's something like, you know, it's too cold in here. Point of privilege, there's an air conditioner blowing and it's right on top of me. Can we do something to change the temperature of the room, or maybe to reduce the noise in the room? Or something else that is not pertinent to the main motion, but needs to be addressed. A recess can also be, is also a privileged motion. You may be in the middle of discussion and we need to take a recess for a few minutes for whatever reason. So those are privileged motions. Incidental motions, a little bit different. They're talking about procedures that arise from other motions, and therefore they have to be considered before other motions. So, for example, a point of order. You know, if somebody has done something that, you know, maybe you started talking about one motion when another motion wasn't finished, you could, you know, raise your hand to be recognized and say, I have a point of order. We didn't finish that main motion. We can't move on to another one yet. And that would be a good point of order. A point of information would be something where you're asking about the particular motion, that something related to the particular motion. You know, and it's, again, not debatable, but something that you are just looking for information on. If you've been to National Convention, we usually do these through a white card. So you've got like red cards when you're against something, green cards when you're for something, and then a white card is I'm neither speaking for or against, I'm looking for information or have a point of order. So those would be incidental motions there. You can also appeal the decision of a chair. That's an incidental motion. I think we talk about that a little bit later on, but it's basically, you know, anytime a chair makes a decision, you can appeal that. That's not appealing the decision of a motion because the body has made that decision. That's a whole different process. So those are the incidental motions there. So let's talk about just generally how motions work. You start with making the motion. And that's something where you would typically say, I move this. So in the example I used before, I move that we have cookies at every meeting. You're then looking for a second. I don't think that particular motion that I'm suggesting would have difficulty getting a second. So somebody would say second, or I second that. Technically, you would wait to be recognized, but that rarely happens. It's usually just sort of a shouted out second or I second it. That's perfectly okay. Who can tell me, or who has a thought on why we have a second? You know, somebody makes a motion. Why do you think we look for somebody to second the motion? Yes, John, you have your hand up.
Is it so that you know that there is at least another person in the body that does also agree with that idea?
Yes, thank you. Or, you know, they probably agree with it. Otherwise, they might not be seconded, but at minimum, they think it's something we should be discussing. So yes, that's exactly right. Because otherwise, you could have, you know, you could have one person who just all day long wants to talk about something and no one else wants to get into that. So, you know, I have certainly seen it done where somebody has moved something and there has been no second. Now, the second is really just the, again, just the confirmation that the body should be discussing it. there is, our national parliamentarian loves to tell stories of, times where he's seen someone trying to be clever, and they're going to let, they realize that a motion was made and then discussion began right away and there was no second on it, and they're going to wait for near the end and they're going to say, point of order, that motion was never seconded and therefore we can't vote on it. They're wrong. Because again, the point of the second is merely to say, yes, the body agrees we should be discussing it. If the body's already had discussion on it, then it's moot. It is by de facto seconded by whoever else was talking about the topic, whether they were for or against. So a second is important, and it should not be overlooked. But if it is overlooked and discussion ensues, the vote can still proceed. After a motion has been made and seconded, the chair should repeat the motion. So it has been moved and seconded that we ... whatever we're talking about. And again, this is just for clarity's sake. This is just so that everybody knows what it is that we're discussing. The debate then happens, and this is people speaking in favor of the motion, people speaking against the motion, people saying, I have this thought about the motion. I may not be specifically for or against it, but this is what I think about the topic. I just want to say cookies are tasty, but not that good for you. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them or we should. I'm just going to point that out there for anyone who doesn't know what a cookie is. After debate comes to an end, this is where the chair should say, okay, looks like debate is over. Are we ready to vote? Now, debate can end a variety of ways. It could just be that everyone has said everything they want to say on the topic. There's no more debate. It could be that there was some limit placed on debate, saying, we're going to have only 5 minutes worth, and we've reached that 5-minute time frame. Or we're going to have 3 people against and 3 people for, and that's all we're going to have. However it's done, the debate comes to a close. Now, there is also a motion that you can make if you want to force debate to end. But if debate is naturally coming to its own closure, you don't need to call the question, as it's called. You don't need to force the debate to come to an end. But regardless of how it happens, once debate is ended, then there's a vote. So all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say nay, or it could be raising hands, it could be standing, it could be by written ballot, secret ballot. There's a variety of ways that voting can happen. For some situations, it's actually specified for a given motion or a given type of a motion for your chapter, how it's going to be decided. For example, elections usually are going to be decided by written ballot. Or you might have, if there's something that is always going to be something that you feel might be contentious, you might want it to be written ballot. Or if you want to be absolutely sure as to the number of people who said yay or nay, you might have it that way, or you might have by a hand vote that's counted. Normally, a voice vote is fine, because normally when you're running a meeting, you can tell. Again, if you've been to National Convention, that's usually reflected by, we do most of our votes there by voice vote. And all those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. And then the chair will say, the ayes have it. The chair is not in doubt is a phrase that gets used a lot. Now, if the chair is in doubt, or if somebody thinks, well, I'm not so sure that the chair called that one right, they can call for some other form of vote to happen, such as division, which again, at national conventions, we would reflect that by all those in favor standing, and then all those opposed standing when it's their turn. So that's the basics of making a motion. It's moved, it's seconded, it's repeated by the chair, debate happens, debate ends, and then a vote is taken. Now, I mentioned we were going to talk about precedents regarding motions, and this is what we're doing here. So you can see, as I mentioned, the main motion all the way down here at the bottom. because that is the main thing that you're discussing. So a motion's been made. There's all these things that can be done on top of that to essentially before we get down to finally deciding on the main motion. You can adjourn or fix a time to adjourn. You can recess. You can have a question of privilege. Nice. Or complaining, as we call it here, which is probably an accurate description of what privilege usually is. And I don't say that as a bad thing. Sometimes you're right to complain. Like if you can't hear what's happening, discussion that's happening, that's something worth bringing up as a question of privilege. You can table a motion, which is to simply delay its being acted upon. You can call the previous question. And what that means is this is when you want to force an end to debate. So if you think debate has gone on too long or things are being repetitive or you just want to do that, you can be recognized and say, I move the previous question. And then that will be the motion that's debated on, or not debated on, sorry. That's the motion that will be decided at that point. You can move to postpone discussion. You can move to refer it to a committee. You can, of course, make an amendment, as we discussed before. And then, of course, there is the main motion. So this is the order of precedence for those motions. There are some motions that we discussed a little bit already that are non-precedence, meaning they are outside of anything to do with that motion there. Or a lot of times they're done outside of when there's a motion on the floor. You can have a point of order called really at any time. And that's where you're pointing out something that you feel is not following the rules. Again, not about the motion specifically necessarily, but it's something is not following the rules. You can appeal the decision of a chair. And that is, again, that is something that you can certainly do. And there's, you need a certain a majority of people to go along with you, but it is another type of motion that is made. You can move to suspend the rules. Now, there are limits on this. It's not a complete anarchy out there in parliamentary procedure world, quite the opposite, but you can certainly move to suspend the rules under certain situations. You can object to consideration of a particular motion. You can call for division, which is, as I mentioned, that's verifying a voice vote. You can ask for a point of information. And again, that could be something like a point of information. What are we discussing again? Could the chair repeat the motion? That would be a point of information. Or it could be a point of information where you're asking about further information on a topic. For example, at a national convention, when we're talking about raising the national dues, someone could say, point of information, what are the current national dues at? I don't recall what they are. And then someone could impart that information. Again, it's not debate, it's just information. Taking from the table, that's when you want to bring a motion that has been tabled, you want to bring it up for discussion. And of course, there is reconsidering a vote, a motion to reconsider. So a vote has already happened, a decision has been made, and you want to reconsider that vote. Now, that has to be done, and I don't think there's exceptions to this. I could be mistaken, but I'm fairly sure that there are not. That has to be done by somebody who voted with the majority. So, let's say you voted on something, it was voted down, and then one of the people who actually voted against it says, actually, I want a motion to reconsider that vote. Perhaps other new information came up, something along those lines, but a motion to reconsider is one valid type of motion that you can make. These are a list of a whole bunch of types of motions. I'll leave this up here for a sec, and I can certainly send this out to anyone who would like to have it. If you would like, just I guess put your put your email address in the chat at some point, and I will copy those before I leave. This is I'm sure that you could find this as well online or something like it. But this is just a list of motions, and are they debatable? Are they are they something that can interrupt the speaker? Is there a vote required, and if so, how much is it? Some votes require a simple majority, which means one more than 50%. Others require a supermajority, something like 2/3, as you see here for a few of these. So I will certainly happily send this out to anyone who would like it. All right, so let's move on. And again, talking about decision making, voting itself, that's where we're making the decision. There are different methods here. Voice, as I said, is the most common and kind of the default there. Show of hands is another. You could do a standing vote. You can do a roll call, and that's where you would call out each person by name and have them vote. If you've ever watched a governmental body work, they often do roll call votes where each senator or each representative or whatever the body is will go up and will cast a particular vote on it. You can do ballot, which is, of course, traditionally slips of paper or some other means, electronic or otherwise, where each person gets to anonymously vote. And then you can have general consent. Now, when I run meetings, I like to kind of shortcut things. I'll certainly use general consent quite a bit if there are topics that I know are not really hot topics that someone's going to really want to debate about. So you can say, all right, by consent, we're going to do this thing. We're going to approve this motion. Now, that assumes that no one objects. If somebody objects, consent will not work. Then you need to go through some other method of voting when the time comes. But if there's been, topic discussion is all favorable to something, you can say, all right, you know what? I'm going to, as chair, I'm going to take a leap here. I'm going to say we all are in agreement on this. So by consent, we will go ahead. Without objection, we will say this motion is passed. There will be cookies at every meeting. If somebody objects, perfectly their right to do so, and then you'll have to take some other method of voting. And as I mentioned before, the bylaws or some other document may determine the method that you use for voting. They may say this type of vote specifically has to be this thing. Now, nominations and elections are a particular part of a meeting agenda and parliamentary procedure that kind of have their own special place. Now, in Alpha Phi Omega, there is no required way to run elections. Each chapter gets to decide. There's a variety of ways that I've seen over the years. Some chapters will use, as it says here, a nominating committee that meets for some period of time and creates a slate of officers saying, we recommend, this person for this office, this person for this office, and so forth. Doesn't mean those people are elected. It just means that's the nominating committee's recommendations. Others chapters will do nominations only from the floor. So if you have a nominating committee, you can certainly take nominations from the floor as well. Some chapters don't have a nominating committee. They only do it from the floor. And then they close nominations when it's clear that there are no more nominations for it. There's tradition in some places, not required at all, but there are traditions of calling 3 times for additional nominations. That way you're making sure that you've got everybody who potentially wants to run for that office or somebody else wants them to run and they're going to agree, that everybody has been nominated who could be. Nominees typically will make a short speech, and then there is a vote on the nominees to decide who the office is going to be, or who the officer will be. And then it's repeated until you filled all the positions that you're dealing with at that time. As it says here, this typically, again, depends on the chapter, but typically it spans multiple meetings. At least the nomination process doesn't usually only occur in one meeting, but every chapter can do the way that they feel is appropriate, so long as it's fair. Now, I mentioned organizational structure before. We've mentioned bylaws a couple of times. The bylaws are, of course, as you know, they're the document on how any organization works. Some chapters will call it a constitution, or you have some other term for it, but bylaws is by far, commonly used. There's no, there are standard templates, but there's no absolute formal, these are the bylaws that your chapter must use. So your own chapter bylaws will typically be based on one of these standard templates that we have in the fraternity, but they're modified to fit whatever the needs of your organization are. That's why your chapter has its own bylaws. Now, as it says here, organizations that have a parent organization need to conform to their rules. So in Alpha Phi Omega, your chapter has bylaws, we have national bylaws. The national bylaws overrule the chapter bylaws. In fact, I actually was literally this week having a conversation with a chapter, and they're like, well, we wanted to do this thing, but our chapter bylaws said that we're not supposed to. I'm like, well, but the national bylaws say you are. And so your chapter bylaws are what you would call a subsidiary document, or they're the, I guess I'll say the inferior document. And I don't mean that to sound as negative as it means, but it means that they have to conform to the national bylaws. So it is important that, as it says here at the end, that everybody understands what the bylaws contain. This kind of summarizes, as I was saying, we have our bylaws nationally. It's important that that is accessible to all members of the fraternity. So all members of your chapter, therefore. These bylaws are modified by a national convention and only by the national convention. So when the national convention meets, and that's typically every 2 years, this year is a little weird, but that's when those revisions happen. And the national convention as a whole gets to decide on those and amend them as per the rules there. Each chapter, of course, again, has bylaws based on standard templates, which includes the standard chapter articles of association, and which you modify based on your particular chapter and university rules and your needs. Every chapter member should have access to the chapter bylaws. So they're not meant to be a secret. They should be readily available so that anyone who is a part of your chapter can look at those and understand what the rules are, because that's, only fair. Standard bylaws would look something like this. Again, you don't have to have it laid out this way, but this is a typical format. You have your name, you have the objective and purpose of the organization. Those are usually fairly straightforward. You have an article on membership, who are the members, what are their authorities based on the type of membership they have. You would have a list of officers and their responsibilities. You would have a section on meetings, the executive board, committees, parliamentary authority, which is, for example, we're going to use a reduced version of Robert's Rules of Order, something like that. And then you would have a section on amendment of the bylaws. You can only amend the bylaws in a way that the bylaws tell you they can be amended. So that's important to know, because, no rule is going to be set in stone forever. Times come when bylaws need to be changed, and that's fine, but you need to have a way to do that. In terms of the membership of the organization, there are different classes of membership, different types of membership. The most common being active, or well, I guess I'll say the most important, being active. You're the active members of the organization, and you are the ones who are making the formal decisions at your chapter. And there are other types of membership as well that your chapter can have, such as associate and honorary and advisory. There are eligibility requirements for those things, and there are certain rights and privileges that each type of member has. Again, there are requirements from the national fraternity. So for example, to be an active member of any chapter, you must be a student at that school. Now, what does that mean? There are different ways to classify it. You know, some chapters say you must be a full-time student because the university requires that. Others would say, no, as long as you're registered for 1 credit, you're good to go. Again, there's some variation in there based on university rules and the desire of the chapter, but there are requirements that the parent organization sets. There's a procedure for becoming a member, of course. There is procedure for removal of membership. This is a very rare thing, as well it should be in Alpha Phi Omega. So hence there's a lot of activity you need to do, a lot of specific things in order for that to occur. Usually, you're not going to specify in the bylaws the amount of dues or other specifics. Usually you would refer that they exist. You know, it might be that we have dues, but you're not going to say what they are. And then you kind of have that in another document. The officers, fairly straightforward. You would have a list of who the officers are, a method for how you're going to select them, whether they're appointed or elected, term of office. So is it for, you know, 1 academic year or for 1 semester or whatever this term might be? A list of the duties, a method of filling vacancies. So if somebody resigns or, you know, has to step down or whatever happens, how are you going to fill that vacancy? And then there should be a method for removal of officers. Again, this should be rare. You know, you don't want to immediately jump to like, well, I don't like this service project that the person planned, so we should impeach the service vice president. Let's, you know, have other remediations first, but there should be a method in the bylaws for how you ultimately would remove an officer if you needed to. Just use it rarely. Meetings should be specified in terms of the types of meetings you're going to have. Regular meetings would be, for example, your, you know, weekly or bi-weekly chapter meetings. You're actually required, last I checked, in the national bylaws to have meetings on a at least bi-weekly basis as a chapter. So you should specify that in your bylaws as to how those are going to happen. And likewise, how there are going to be special meetings called, or if there's annual meetings that you have to, you know, do caps or set goals or things like that. You don't want to specify in the bylaws exactly the date, time, and location of those meetings because, you know, things can change. But you should determine, you should specify in the bylaws how are those things going to be decided. So, you know, for example, you don't want to say we're going to hold our annual CAPS meeting on June 20th every year. But you do want to say, you know, CAPS will be held annually at a time and place to be determined at a regular business meeting or something like that. Committees also are good to specify. Now, different chapters use committees to varying degrees. But you know, you do want to specify what committees you have. You want to say whether they're standing committees, meaning that they are permanent, or whether it's called select committees, which are just committees for specific purposes on a short term, perhaps. For example, if you were planning a conference, you would put up a committee for the period of time leading up to that, or some other event. And then once that event is done, you don't need the committee to continue to exist. But you want to define, of course, for the committee, you know, who's chairing it, what's the makeup of the committee, and what is the purpose? Because ultimately, a lot of work in the fraternity gets done in the committees. And of course, in the bylaws, you do want to have, as I mentioned before, amendments. How are the bylaws going to be amended? How are they going to get the word out to members? How are the members going to go forward and decide on those? And this is how, eventually you will need to amend your bylaws. So you should make sure you have this in here because you want to know how you're going to go about that process. And other documents that you have, you may have standing rules, you may have policies and procedures. In fact, you probably should. As I mentioned, you don't want to get into complete detail on some topics in the bylaws. Bylaws should be more general things that are not going to change that often. So something like dues or requirements for active membership, things like that don't need to be fully spelled out in the bylaws. It can be said, there will be dues as will be determined each year by the chapter. And requirements, there will be membership requirements that are determined by the membership policy that will be decided on by the chapter. And then the chapter decides in the membership policy, because then you can more easily adjust them if you need to as well. Here are some basic parliamentary authorities. Robert's Rules of Order, of course, is the one that is most prevalent, most known. There's also one called Sturgis, the Standard Code of Parliamentary Procedure. Doesn't typically get used in Alpha Phi Omega. And your chapter can come up with your own way of doing it. So long as it's fair, and so long as people understand it, that's okay. I've known chapters who specifically did not use Robert's Rules of Order and had their own rules, although admittedly they were actually pretty similar, but just at a very basic level. And this is just a list of some resources out here. The most important, I would say, really for you for any chapter are the national bylaws and the standard chapter articles of association, because those are really the governing documents of the fraternity that are most pertinent to you. And that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation here. As it says here, I guess much of this presentation was based on some work that a brother named Michael Brown did quite some time back, it seems. Like I said, I got this presentation from brother Jeff Cantor, but according to him, much of this came from there. So first, let me say thank you for sticking with me through this. I know that this can be a very dry topic. It's not for everyone, but on the other hand, you knew what it was when you came in, so you signed up for it. In the few minutes we have left, are there any questions that anyone has? Anything you wanted to bring up? And I'll certainly do my best to get you an answer. In the meantime, while you're considering that, I'm going to copy down these email addresses from before. All right. Well, seeing no questions, I will simply repeat my saying thank you. I really greatly appreciate you sticking with me through this. I found out about, I guess I want to say about 10 o'clock last night that I'd be doing this presentation. So I'm glad I was able to come here and join you for it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. If you, I will put my email address here in the chat as well. If you have any questions on, really anything related to Alpha Phi Omega, parliamentary procedure or otherwise, you are certainly welcome to email me. My name is Michael Haber, and so I have a really easy email address. Just email michael.haber@apo.org, and that will get to me. And once again, thank you very much, and I hope you have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's really nice. I know, this is a last minute